We'll do a countdown. Okay.
Shabbat Shalom. How's everyone doing? I was telling the folks here that did the setup this morning, I can't wait until we can all meet again and have our interpersonal interactions on Shabbat. I so much miss that. I'm sure you guys do as well. Unfortunately, somebody just read to me a new pronouncement this morning that the governor has extended the restrictions till sometime in early July. So I guess we'll all have to be patient. I've been looking forward to the topic that I'm going to teach today. What I'm going to cover is the year of Jubilee and how it's coordinated with the Shemitah a little bit, and have that lead into Revelations chapter 6, which has some very intriguing information about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. We're going to ask the question and try to answer the question of, are the events today reflective of a Jubilee, and are they reflective of the seal events? And then I want to switch to Revelations chapter 3, which I believe, as well as Adam, we've taught this for many years, that we believe that one of the letters is specifically targeted to the congregation that lives and exists during this period. In fact, we are in the end times period. So with all of that, let's start with announcements. Jody, can you come up?
Shabbat Shalom. You should have received your bulletin via email last night. And our main announcement is that we have food, a wonderful food pickup at 12 noon today. So right following this live streaming, you want to come on down to the Bear Creek building. We'll have that in the parking lot. We'll be doing a lineup of cars so that we can keep with the performa that we're supposed to. Also, we want to really thank you for your tithes. Tithes can be given at houseofcovenant.org. There's a link there. It says tithe right at the top. And also they can be mailed to John Klein, care of House of Covenant at our address. That's right there in the bulletin. Let's do the Omer count. So Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu v'tzivanu v'tzivanu sefirat haomer. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us by your commandments and commands us regarding the counting of the Omer. Hayom arba, Hayom echad v'esrim yom yamim shahem shlosha shavuot la'omer. Today is 21 days, which is 3 weeks, exactly 3 weeks of the Omer. We're looking forward to Shavuot.
Last week, we talked about the economy, and I proposed some different outcomes that might occur. We talked about the V-shaped economy and the U-shaped economy and the L-shaped economy, which is the worst type of economy. And today I want to marry a little bit of that information with the concept of the Jubilee. Before we go any further, let's open this up with prayer. Father, we come before you, we worship you. Even though we're separated, we can still all as a congregation worship together and praise you and lift our voices and our hands to you and exclaim that you are the mighty one, you are the creator, you're the one that gets our eye. Father, we love and adore you, and I pray that these words are a blessing to you and that you speak through them to help people on their way to getting to know you and develop their relationship with you better and better. Father, we thank you and adore you. In your name, amen. So last week I talked a little bit about
how debt marginally bad things to have a build-up on it. There's good debt, but what usually happens over the course of time is bad debt starts to develop. What is bad debt? Bad debt is debt that is made
by people that don't have the ability to pay the debt off, or may even make the payments. Maybe the debt was originally good, but by poor management or mismanagement or just lack of knowledge, or sometimes even criminal activity, good debt can evolve into poor debt. And over the course of time, recessions come, and what should happen during these times is this poor debt. Maybe it's due to corporations mismanaging their products or their companies or their employees, or maybe it's personal debt. People lose their job or injuries occur. Bad things happen, or maybe even mismanagement of household finances cause good debt where one was originally able to make the payment to become bad debt, where it's an extreme stress on the individual to be able to continue to make that payment. So what ends up happening is recessions come, and what should happen and what should be allowed to happen from a biblical perspective is that those debts should be allowed to be expunged. Our Constitution in the United States has a bankruptcy code that, if you investigate it, a lot of the bankruptcy laws emanate right out of biblical principles. So that was there in the Bible as well as in our Constitution to allow the elimination of debt. What happens during a bankruptcy is bad debt gets expunged. Yes, the person that has the note that is expecting payments to be received loses, but he was probably, or that investor was probably going to lose in the long run anyway because it was bad debt. And this is a normal economic cycle that God actually anticipated. So what he did was he instructed a concept to prevent this type of thing from building up in the Israelite economy, so there wouldn't be a catastrophic collapse of Israel's economy. And this is called the Jubilee. It happens every 50 years. And God gave instructions in mostly in Leviticus 25, on how this Jubilee concept is to be managed. Why is this important to the book of Revelation and end times? Well, what is the greatest pile of debt, and it's all very poor debt, that has ever been accumulated in the history of mankind? And when will that great pile of bad debt be expunged? Of course, it's at the resurrection, at his second coming. God is going to wipe all the debts clean and start anew, just like the Jubilee concept. All the debts are wiped new. The land goes back to its original owner, and that is exactly what we see at the end of days. We see this transfer of the promised land back to Israel. Read all about it at the end of Ezekiel, how this land is going to be transferred back to Israel. And it's coordinated with the second coming of the Messiah. So this Jubilee is coordinated also with the Shemitah year. The Shemitah year is kind of a small case Jubilee. Some debts are expunged, but some other things occur during the Jubilee. Both the Shemitah and the Jubilee have this in common. They're years of rest. There's no planting, there's no harvesting. God promised that if you practice these two celebrations, the Shemitah and the Jubilee, that the preceding year he would double or triple their harvest so they would have enough to make it through these years where they were instructed not to plant anything. Well, these Shemitah years occur every seventh year. And as we count up the counting of the Omer to 49, and then the 50th is the feast, so also it mirrors the counting up of the Jubilee. So there's 7 weeks that lead up to Shavuot. There's 7 weeks that lead up to the Feast of Shavuot. There's also 7 years times 7 that lead up to the Jubilee. Now, it's interesting to note that when you take a look at this biblical concept of if we would just follow the Bible's instructions, we would negate catastrophic economic occurrences in our nations. For example, in the United States, we started off in 1780s, plus or minus, with a economic depression. Why was that occurring? There were trade issues and tax issues all emanating out of England that were forced onto the American colony, and it caused a complete disruption of that economy. And so the war that won our independence was fought in the midst of a depression. So following suit, what happened 50 years later? During President Jackson's presidency in 1830, about 50 years, there was another great American depression caused by the same sort of thing God warned us about, the buildup of debt and other issues that tend to build up over time and cause the economy to be dysfunctional. So 50 years after that, 1880, another crash occurred. 50 years after that, we all know what happened in 1929. For the next 10, 12 years, we call that period the Great Depression, and it's the worst economic depression recorded in American history. 50 years after that was 1980. What happened in 1980? Some of you younger people probably may not be aware, but that was another it was the most extreme economic crisis that we had since the 1930s. We had interest rates go from 6-7%, and they skyrocketed above 20%, up to 24% for short-term money you had to pay.
On loans, mortgages were 16 to 18%, depending on your credit. 16 to 18%, guess what? Nobody bought any homes. you recall last week.
About my personal life, where there was a destruction of my assets, that occurred in 1980, that major crisis, and we have not had that extent of crisis since then. Even in '08, it wasn't as bad. So the next crisis would, if you continue the time frame, would be plus or minus 2030. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Now, these Jubilee-esque historical records in the United States aren't necessarily a reflection of when the Jubilee occurs in Israel's time frame. Unfortunately, the rabbis have lost the record of when the Jubilee year occurs. Since I've been aware of this Jubilee concept 20, 25 years ago, it seems like every year I hear somebody proclaiming that next year is the Jubilee year. And I'm going, well, wait a minute. It can't be a Jubilee year. Why? What do we know about when a Jubilee occurs? It always occurs after a Shemitah. Remember the 7 Shemitahs that lead up to the Jubilee? Well, the Jubilee follows the 7th Shemitah, the 7th 7-year period. Just like we count up the Omer count, there's 7 weeks in the Omer count, there's 7 sets of 7 years in the Jubilee cycle, and those 7-year periods are called Shemitah periods. Well, the Jubilee follows the 7th Shemitah. So these people can only be right 1 out of every 7 years. So we have been able to follow the Shemitah year. And the last one started in 2014. So all we can do is propose that after every Shemitah, it could be a Jubilee. So with that in mind, we should keep our eyes open for some events that might suggest that maybe some future Jubilee might fit into prophetic material. These things would include economic collapse, Israel returning to the promised land and dwelling and setting up their rule in an environment of peace, and the second coming of God. Some suggestions that those kind of events are happening in the biblical prophetic material in order for a Jubilee to be spotted. Last week we talked about, as I've suggested, these economic events that are very startling, and they've become even more startling over the last week. We had new unemployment numbers released. Last week's 5-week unemployment record was 10 times greater than the previous record. Now the new numbers were released Thursday, and now we're 12 times the previous record for a 6-week period of unemployment totals. And many other pieces of data coming from our government that have been released just this week. They're all astronomical records. They don't beat the previous record by a smidgen. They beat the previous record by huge amounts. The consequences could be huge. We will have to wait and see. What I wanted to do today, however, is not dwell on that, but see if some of these events that we see unfolding in our day could be the harbingers, or maybe the first push of the next domino in the book of Revelation that will lead us to knowing that the end is getting much closer. So I want to jump into Revelation 6 to kind of explore that topic a little bit. Madam and I have been teaching this in December and mostly in January of this year, so I'm not going to get into great detail on these seals, but I do want to cover them in brief, just as a point so we can scan them quickly to see if there's any of these events that are occurring today, to see if they line up with any prophetic events that Revelation 6 proposes as events that will lead up to the coming of Messiah. Recall all of these, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, including the fifth seal, all marry Revelation 24 when the disciples ask the Messiah what will be the evidence of your second coming? And so if you read that chapter and then read Revelation 6, you see that Yeshua was actually mirroring both these two chapters together. What he said in 24 is exactly what he says and reveals to John, and that John revealed to us by writing the Revelation. So let's read Revelation 1, starting with 1. Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying, as with a voice of thunder, "Come." I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow and a crown was given him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Recall that this scroll is a book that's introduced in the previous chapter. And Adam and I have taught this many times, that this is not just any old scroll. It is absolutely not the book of life. That isn't opened up till much later. It's opened up in chapter 19, chapter 20, not here. This is not the book of life. This is a marriage contract, and it's sealed with seven seals. And what John is now seeing in the next chapter, 6, each one of these seals are being confronted and removed. And these seals represent authorities. And so these authorities, just like in the Old Testament, from which all of these concepts come and emanate from, these authorities have, remember in Deuteronomy, right at the end of the book, Moses is wrapping up his life, or God is wrapping up Moses' life, and Moses is given the responsibility to write the last book of Torah, which is Deuteronomy. And in it, it's very intriguing, he has a set of chapters that talk about, if you follow this law, I will bless you. If you don't follow this law, I will bring judgment on you. I will bring curses. I will, it won't go well with you. Well, this is exactly what these authorities are doing. Basically, these authorities are going, world, have you recognized my Son and believed by faith in his works to procure salvation? And how are you doing with holiness? Are you following the law? If so, then these authorities bring blessing just like the book of Deuteronomy proposes. God said he has the authority to bring blessing to his people. But if you don't, then there's not going to be blessing, there's going to be judgment falling. And that's exactly what we see in these seals. As they're being broken off, we see the authorities. I'm not referring to people so much as God having the authority to do this. We see this authority coming down in the form of judgment over the entire world. And this first horse rider, as Adam and I have taught many times, this is not Yeshua, the Savior, coming down out of heaven, rapturing up the church. This is the enemy pretending to be the Savior, coming on a white horse. It's not accidental that he's choosing a white horse. He should actually be riding a black horse because he's evil and he's a deceiver. But he's not coming. He's never going to come and say, I'm the Savior, is he? He's going to come and say he's the Messiah. He's going to come and say he's the Messiah to the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims, because all three of those religions have messianic prophecies, and all those people that follow those religions are waiting for the coming of their Messiah. And Satan is all about fulfilling or attempting to fulfill all of these prophecies, and they're all going to be fooled. Satan, riding this white horse, Adam and I have explained and gone through why he is not the Messiah. If you're interested in all of that, pick up our books that expound and go into detail. Just know that this guy is not the real McCoy. He's a pretender. And we see him throughout the pages of Revelation pretending to be the Messiah. When does the Messiah actually come? He does come riding on a white horse, but not till Revelation chapter 19. So, the next horse rider, starting in Rev 3, when he broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, come, and another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men could slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. We've gone in the past into great detail why this red horse rider and horse that take peace from the earth is not the Reds. It's not China, it's not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, but many times we call the communistic nations red. And so a lot of prognosticators have taken that concept and go, oh, right there, that's Russia or China attacking Israel once again and fulfilling biblical prophecy. Because they will attack, but not here. This comes from a very ancient reference. And it's buttressed by 4 prophecies in the Old Testament that talk about this war, and you can find them in Obadiah, Isaiah 34, Ezekiel 35, and Psalms 83. These, if Jody, I don't need all that. So these prophecies talk about one family out of Genesis 10, one family that were called red. Remember Esau? What was he called? He was called Edom. And when was he started? When did his name change from Esau to Edom? After he traded his birthright for red soup. People were so profoundly disturbed by that trade that the ancients decided to name him after his foolhardy trade with Jacob. So this is a reference, we believe, to Esau, and it's totally complemented by these 4 different prophecies that I just named that talk about Esau, referring sometimes to him as Edom and sometimes to him as Mount Seir, which is where he fled to or migrated to, which is south of the Dead Sea. He's called all 3 of those names in these prophecies. And these prophecies talk about how the descendants of Esau will, at the very end of time, attack Israel. We believe that these prophecies, going into great detail about this war, are being told by God where they occurred in the book of Revelation during the end times. Has this war started yet? Not really. We can see some rumblings. There's been some efforts. People have said some of the Seventh-day War and some other wars that since Israel has become a nation, we've seen some people go, oh, that's this Psalms 83 war or the Ezekiel 35 war or whatever. But it's not true. Why do we know? Because in Psalms 83, it gives all the allies that Esau has that attack Israel. And there's one excluded, and that's Egypt. Egypt has been involved in all of these preceding wars. This coming war, Egypt, for whatever reason, will stand apart and not be part of this end times war. But we don't see a massive war. We've seen, over the last, since 73, we haven't really seen any great war such as described in detail in these prophecies, have we? So we're not seeing anything. Are we seeing first horse rider? Have we seen deception? Yes, we have. It's running rampant in our world today and has been picking up speed over the last few decades, hasn't it? And I think over the ensuing years, we're going to see some final moves by Satan to bring his end game into being, but not yet. So the next horse rider, starting in verse 5. When he broke the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature saying, "Come." I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. And do not damage the oil and the wine." Now here we have if you read between the lines here, there's some obvious implications. Sounds like there's an economic collapse. There's a jubilee occurring, not a biblical jubilee, but an out of control, man, debt-ridden caused jubilee because of his mismanagement we see some events it alludes to rampant inflation. It possibly could be referring to famine. Food prices are going through the roof. You have to work all day for a loaf of bread. There's a reference to scales, which is a reference to man's management of himself, the economy, the nations. It goes back to Babylon. Remember that passage where Belshazzar is found, the handwriting appears on the wall, and the message that Daniel gives by interpreting the writing on the wall is, you have been found wanting. In other words, you've been found too light. And how many of us want to ever be found in God's eyes to be too light? No, we want to be found heavy, don't we? Yeshua was found heavy. Heavy with what? What is he measuring here? Several things. Truth and knowledge and relationship. We want to be found heavy with relationship with God, intimacy with God, and truth about God, right? That's why in John, he's many times referred to as the capital T truth. So this third horse rider is bringing some catastrophic economic trouble upon the globe. And there could be some reason to believe that there's some worldwide famines occurring. The fourth horse rider, starting in 7, when the Lamb broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the 4 living creatures saying, "Come." I looked, and behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Sounds like a real fun horse rider, doesn't it? No, it doesn't. Death and Hades, this horse rider is named Death. He's given the authority to kill 1/4 of the population of the earth. Has anything like that happened? No. So we know this has not occurred, and it currently isn't occurring. And what are these killed by? It's kind of a wrap up of all the preceding horses, isn't it? Because it talks about the sword. Well, the second horse rider, how did he kill? He killed by the sword. And it talks about pestilence and famine, which kind of refers to the third horse rider, with food being in short supply, costing a whole day's wage to earn a small bit of food. So it's this fourth horse rider is kind of a composition of the previous riders and having the authority to devastate the earth population, unfortunately. Now, could our virus be that? Certainly pestilence and these wild beasts. The word there gets interpreted wild beasts, but it includes everything from microbial wild beasts to lions. Now, I don't think that there's going to be a resurgence in the lion population of the earth that's going to start taking out millions of people, but I do think that it's very possible that viral explosions could occur that impact large populations. This virus, it might be the very beginning, but it's really not killing millions, and certainly not billions. It's killing hundreds of thousands. So it could lead to that. It could be a harbinger of the worst diseases by pestilence that might be coming. God tends to do that. Recall in Matthew 24, where he talks about these troubles that are going to come in a fashion of birth pains, right? So it's going to get bad, and then it's kind of going to get better. And you think, oh, maybe there isn't a baby. And then it gets really, really bad. And then it gets better, and by then you kind of get a clue that, well, this is just a little window of peace. Why do you think God does it that way? Because he's giving us a little bit of space to think through what we're doing. What kind of choices are you making in your lives? And if that doesn't catch your attention, then he goes, okay, here comes another set of trouble. He doesn't always bring trouble. Sometimes he brings blessing. And why does he bring blessing? Multiple reasons. One, if you look at the patriarchs in the Old Testament, many times he would bring trouble followed by blessing if they did well. So in our own life, it mirrors the same. In my own life, it mirrors that. God brought blessing, then he brought trouble. And he somewhat took away what he gave. God's not an Indian giver, though, is he? As I aligned my life with him, so he brought blessing. And as I stayed moored to that, the troubles became less because I didn't need to relearn those significant lessons again. The things that I was learning were more, it's kind of like a tune-up. He didn't have to change out the entire engine. He was just tuning up. And your life should look the same way. It should start off with maybe significant troubles because God's going, okay, we got to redesign the entire engine. And then as you mature in your walk, it becomes more subtle. There's minor variations, more like a tune-up rather than changing the entire engine out. This fourth horse rider is unfortunately fulfilling the end game of Deuteronomy, the curses in Deuteronomy, aren't they? Because in the end, in the book of Deuteronomy, at the end of the curses, what does God say that he will do if you do not turn? God sends these troubles into our lives for us to turn because he loves us. He wishes none to perish. So he gives us these troubles. He knows how to draw his to himself. Some people will harden their heart and never turn, but he knows how to get those that are his. And he sends trouble into our lives so we get a clue and we align our lives with his plan for us. But those that don't, God has promised that if you reject his son, if you reject his ways, let alone not having a car to fine tune, your car is destroyed. What is yourself, God is going to judge and you end up dying. Because that's the choice you've made. You've chosen to live a life without God in it, and certainly chosen a life that does not conform to his plan for you. Of course, the fifth seal talks about some believers that have passed away and they're seen up in heaven before the bronze altar, the altar that where the sacrifices were burnt. And these guys have died of, because they've been persecuted and do we see any Jubilee-esque evidences in them? Is there an economic crash in them? A little bit. In the third horse rider, we see a little bit of implication of economic collapse, don't we? Do we see Israel going back to the land and being blessed and rewarded with the land back? Because that's one of the hallmarks of the Jubilee, is God's people. That doesn't just refer to the Israelites of old, it refers to all believers, doesn't it? If you read at the end of Ezekiel, you see that the Gentiles are included with the inheritance along with the 12 tribes of Israel as inheritors of the land. Very interesting passage. Do we see any of that here? No, we don't see any of that. Do we see any suggestion that God's second coming? Some would say, oh yes, the first horse rider is dressed, is on a white horse. But as we've discovered, it's the wrong white horse. Satan is going to come to represent and purport to be the Messiah, but it's a con. It's a deception. Remember, what's his speciality? Deception. He's going to come first, then the real Messiah is going to come. But not until a bunch of chapters later, chapter 19, he finally comes. So, in some future year, we'll hear that seventh trumpet blast, which will start the Jubilee, but I don't believe we find it in the seals. Do the current events, do we find those in these seals? I think only in very minor ways. We don't have a war, we don't have a financial collapse, we certainly have deception running rampant, and we don't have these deaths on a worldwide basis described in chapter 6. We don't have that level. We have some, but not nearly enough to qualify for this. Now, could these events lead up? Could they be harbingers of these events? Absolutely, but we would need to see, last week I was talking about that L-shaped economy, economic recovery. We would need to see that. We won't know that for 6, 12 months. Certainly we'll have a better look by the end of the summer. But right now we see very dimly the future about our economy. We can certainly make some proclamations about what's going on, that we continue to prop up those debt holders that should be allowed to go bankrupt. That's what the Federal Reserve is doing. It's propping up large corporations, the too big to fail guys. It's propping those guys up. They should be liquidated, and all that debt should be expunged so we have a natural jubilee. But they're not allowing that to occur. So we're building and building and building up with more and more destructive debt. When it does come tumbling down, instead of jumping off a 10-foot cliff, we'll be jumping off a 100-foot cliff. The results of those two are completely different. That's what we'll see when the events of the seals come. We don't see those yet. We don't have a war yet either, although it's interesting. We do see some rumblings. Some of us have been following this oil price reduction. We're starting to see little bits of it at the gas station. I talked about it at length last week, so I won't get into it again this week. But it's interesting to note, with oil prices way down where they are today, no nation can survive, no oil producing nation can survive these prices. Certainly the United States can't. They need 40 to 60, 70, some of the oil wells need $70 a barrel. Right now they're $5 to $20 a barrel, depending on the grade of crude that they pump out of the ground. It's interesting that the two most important oil exporting countries, Iran and Russia, are being devastated. Both of those countries receive most of their exporting income coming from oil exports. You know, like the United States is much more diverse. We export cars and all kinds of things to the world. So if our oil exports get ruined, it doesn't really bother us that much. But these two countries, their primary export revenue source is oil. So they're sitting there getting financially destroyed the longer these oil prices stay at these levels. And I don't see anything on the horizon that would change the oil price structure for the next few months, except one thing. Who in Psalms 83, we talked about how this one war in the second seal, the red horse rider, who are basically constitute, if you read Psalms 83, it goes through and it talks about all the peoples that ally with Esau. And they're basically different tribes of Esau and a few others, and then one other nation that seems to be the instigator. Does anybody know who that is? Correct, it's Persia. And who's Persia? Persia is today, it's Iran, okay? The Iranian economy is being decimated. Now, what's this one event that could turn oil prices around on a dime? A nice war. You have Iran instigate this red horse rider war. I'm just speculating here, but they could instigate this attack on Israel, fulfilling all of those prophecies. And what would happen to the price of oil? Throw in a few rockets over to Saudi Arabia to boot, like they've already tried to do, and the price of oil would skyrocket. Why? Because 1/3 of the world's exports come from the Persian Gulf countries, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. 1/3 of the export oil comes from those countries. So you start a war in that region, and you're going to severely impact the exporting of oil to the rest of the world, causing a huge increase in the price of oil, playing right into the hands of Russia and Iran, which would be part of their motivation. Plus, we all know that the Iranian leadership, not the Iranian people so much, but the Iranian leadership have for years stated it as their political goal to push Israel into the sea, to destroy it. When you read Psalms 83, it sounds like you're reading newspaper headlines today. So it's certainly a possibility, but it hasn't happened yet. There's rumblings, but we don't see those events actually occurring yet. So we need to keep our eyes peeled for tensions increasing. This last week, Trump made a statement that if Iran chooses to attack Americans over in Iraq again, he's going to, I forget his exact phrase, but the implication was that Iran would pay dearly. And of course, just even that statement caused oil prices to jump in the ensuing 2 days that followed. So the events that we're seeing might certainly be the first couple of dominoes being pushed over, but we need much more significant events to follow. Certainly, the events we see today could cause the next dominoes that lead to these seals very easily. We could paint that picture, but we need, if these are going to be fulfilled, we would need to see a continuation of worsening conditions. So let's jump to Revelations 3, because all of this is, we don't really want hell to come on earth like these seals describe. We really don't, that's not what we want to see. We just know it's going to come. These terrifying judgments are going to occur. And God is trying to get people to wake up and realize that the time for choosing Him is running out. So He's doing everything godly possible to get humanity's attention, to turn their eyes to Him on a salvational level, but also to turn their eyes on Him to maybe work out some details that need to be cleaned up in our lives. I don't think if we knew how bad it was going to be, and some of us have an inkling because we've been students of end-time prophecy, if we know what's coming at us, the less baggage we carry into it, the better we will be. It's kind of like going on a long backpack, and we know how many miles it is and how much gain in the terrain we're going to have to take. If we know all of that, we would maybe lighten the load, right? We could get rid of some things we really don't need, especially things that aren't working in our favor, like, the joke when you're going backpacking is to sneak some rocks inside the pack of your friend, only to have him discover it at the top of the mountain, that he's been carrying unneeded baggage that helps not at all, and deters him from actually reaching his goal. We don't need those rocks. We need to get rid of those rocks and replace them with the capital R rock. Revelation 3 has, let me get there myself here. Revelation 2 and Revelation 3 have letters to, there's seven letters to 7 congregations in Western Turkey. And Adam and I have taught this for years and gone into great detail about each one of these letters, the implications, etc. I will not do that. We don't have time for that. But what I would like to do is talk about this letter, because this letter, if we are approaching these end time days, this letter is written to us as an encouragement. Now, some would say, no, wait a minute. I thought the last letter, the seventh letter, to the congregation in Laodicea is the end time congregation message, but it's not. Adam and I have explained thoroughly why it's not. I won't belabor that point, but only to say that during times of trouble, the Laodicea congregation was called lukewarm. They weren't either. There wasn't goodness in them. They were just lukewarm. I won't get into all of that detail, but where do you find churches that aren't going anywhere? In places where there isn't any persecution, in places where there isn't any trouble. People, during the 9/11 crisis, guess what happened? It seemed like the whole nation flooded to their local church. Unfortunately, it didn't have any staying power. We needed more 9/11, facetious, more 9/11s, I guess. We needed more trouble to keep people in congregations hearing God's word. But because there wasn't any follow-up trouble, all the interest in God and all of the instability in our emotions died off because there weren't any more planes flying into buildings. Everything went back to the way it was. So like Israel, so like America, we went back to our old ways. And, that was almost 20 years ago. And we've come a long way down the path since then. And I mean down, not up. The troubles prophesied in Revelation will make 9/11 look like nothing. All for the purpose of getting our attention. So the message to the congregation in Laodicea is a perfect message to a congregation that has no trouble. And what happens during the 1,000-year reign? Well, the 1,000-year reign, what exists during that time period? Yeshua and his bride are dwelling on the earth, creating peace. And where's Satan? He's locked up in the bottomless pit. So he's not running around the landscape. The only trouble that's being created is humanity's own sinful nature. That might cause some trouble, but most of the sources of trouble have been negated. So this congregation during this 1,000-year period has kind of lost its motivation. It's unfortunate that we need 9/11s or wars or giant financial trouble or just personal catastrophic events in our personal lives to drive us to God, isn't it? Should that be the way that it is? No, but God knows how we're made. And he knows that sometimes blessing doesn't work, so he brings trouble, all for the purpose of driving us to him. That's what this congregation does. And what happens? At the end of the 1,000-year reign, trouble arrives in the form of Satan is released from the bottomless pit. Trouble now arrives on the earth one last time, and unfortunately, a lot of these people who never got their relationship with God right join in with Satan again, and they suffer the great white throne judgment on the curse side, don't they? So this Revelation 3, this letter to Philadelphia, the letter that precedes the letter to the congregation to Laodicea, is the one for us because we precede the 1,000-year reign. It's the letter to Philadelphia. Let me just read it, and we'll just kind of pick it apart as we go. It starts in Rev 3, verse 7. And to the angel of the congregation in Philadelphia, I say most of your scripts are saying church here, but the word church never appears in the entire Bible. Okay? Church is not in the text. What is in the text is a Greek word, ecclesia, which is the Septuagint equivalent word for the Hebrew word kala. And this word means, when you see in the Old Testament, it's kahal. This word in the Old Testament refers to, it gets interpreted into English as the assembly or the congregation of Israel. And in the New, the writers are being very they're continuing the same vocabulary. They're not using the word church. They're using the same concept of the assembly, the called out ones, the congregation of Israel. And Israel, understand that it's a growing concept. It starts off with just the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham. But it grows, doesn't it? The whole purpose of God selecting the Hebrews was so the message of God's love for humanity would emanate from them, and it would invite the rest of the world. And as we see in the biblical text, the concept of Israel grows and grows and grows. Yes, it starts with the Hebrew people, but it expands, like Paul suggests, to include all believers, no matter what their nationality. So this congregation of Israel, by the time we reach the 1st century AD, what do we see? God referring to all believers in the world by using this language, this congregation in Philadelphia. It says, he who is holy, who is true, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, and who shuts and no one opens, says this. Before we read the next verse, let's focus on this a little bit. What's this key of David? What is that referring to? A key is something that gives you authority to many times go into the next room or open something up, right? And David had this authority to move into maybe a sphere of authority. Who was David? He ruled plus or minus 1000 BC. He had the authority to rule and be king over Israel. This is a reference to the one who has the key of David. Who is the ultimate ruler prophesied to be the descendant of David that's going to rule the world? Of course, the Messiah, Yeshua, our Savior. So it's an allusion to the ultimate capital K King, the Messiah, and the authority that he has. And he will have the authority He does have the authority. He just is allowing us time to choose him or not. But he does have the authority to rule the world, and he will by the time this whole prophecy is over. And opening and shut, I think this is a reference to, especially in this context, I think it's a salvational thing. God is saying, no one can steal you out of my hand except you. You can choose not to take me into your heart. You can choose not to accept the free gift. But no one else can throw you, including God himself. If you accept that free gift, God's going to covet you. He's going to protect you, and no one is going to be able to close the door to you as that door is open to you. It's your choice. You get to choose it, and he has the authority to keep that door open to you. And we can certainly take comfort knowing that that authority, that open door is still there for us. And it's not just salvational, it's maturational as well. God has the authority to keep the door open to you, even if we fail and fail and fail. Sometimes at the same trial. Sometimes we go through the same trials again and again. God goes, okay, we're going to go through it again. This time, make better choices. Because the purpose is to get us ready to go into battle. We have a war to win, one inside and one externally. We all need to be ambassadors for God. We all have a mission to bless, help, encourage, teach, support others. But if we're constantly fighting our own internal battles, our own immaturity, God goes, okay, back to boot camp. Let's read verse 8. I know your deeds, behold, I have put before you an open door, which no one can shut, because you have a little power, and have kept my word, and have not denied my name. I know your deeds. Yes, you win salvation, you win righteousness by faith through the shed blood of Yeshua on the cross. But so many times, this Yeshua here is emphasizing deeds. Why are deeds? I know your deeds. Why is that so important? Because he doesn't want us to be feeble babies that don't hear his voice, don't know his voice, don't know his truth, and don't, most importantly, don't implement all of those things, don't integrate all those things into our life. We're supposed to look like him because we're supposed to be doing the deeds he did and greater even. And then it says I've read this for years since I was a teenager. I've read this verse. I've grappled with what it means. It says, I'm going to open this door and that no one can shut because you have a little power. I'm like, okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean we have a little power compared to Satan? A little power compared to God? A little power compared to what we should be having? What does it mean? I have no idea, but I can say this. Because of the positive nature of this verse, we have enough power. And that is the thing we should focus on, not the fact that we have a little power, but the fact that we have enough. It talks about faith in the New Testament. It said, man, if your faith is very, very small, the size of a mustard seed, you'll have enough. So it's not the size, it's the fact that you do have faith. Here it's the fact that you do have some power. It's a little power, but it's enough power for you to achieve the goals God has written for you in the book of life. In verse 9, it says, "Behold, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. I will make them come and bow down at your feet and make them know that I have loved you. Because you have kept the word of my perseverance, I also will keep you from the hour of testing," that hour which is about to come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. Wow. So what is verse 9 all about? It's kind of an intriguing passage. It's talking about those from the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. During these times, 2,000 years ago, 1900 and some years ago, the disciples were going out into the unknown, going out into the Gentile world. They were going out into areas where Jews lived, and they were spreading the gospel, the good news about the resurrection of Yeshua and the hope and that comes via the power over death, and how God is going to share that with all of us, everlasting life with him forever. They were spreading this out. This was the concept of faith that started right from the beginning back in Genesis, that through faith we can become righteous. God, through his act on the cross, could bring salvation to all mankind and save us from the penalty of sin. What was happening, however, is there were some that were going behind Paul and some of the other disciples and dispensing perversion. And what that was, no, your salvation does not come via the works of Yeshua, it comes via your works. So as you become more holy, like Torah recommends you be, you can save yourself. Do works lead to salvation? Do they lead to righteousness? Which is what the New Testament refers to. Like Paul many times will refer to, it's the righteous ones that procure salvation. No. Righteousness is procured by faith. Is that what's going on here? These guys were saying, no, it's not procured by faith. It's procured by works. But the Bible is very clear. Through works you acquire holiness, not righteousness / salvation. So what was happening is Paul and some of the other disciples who were had a traveling ministry, they had, unfortunately, people coming up in their wake and saying that, no, those apostles and their preaching is wrong. What is really right is the same thing that they had been purporting for a long time, which was you need to be holy. Yeah, you need to be holy, but holiness doesn't get you salvation. Unfortunately, Talmudic rabbis today preach the same thing. They recommend, that's why many wealthy Jews are leaders in philanthropic organizations. They promote helping poor, and they lead or organize organizations, which are all wonderful, to help those in need, whether they're in our own country or over in far-flung nations. Those that are in need, good Jews will support and lead these philanthropic efforts to give out of their wealth to those in need. Unfortunately, these kind of efforts are wonderful and make you holy, but works and holiness is not equivalent with salvation and righteousness. Paul makes it perfectly clear that they're not the same. Works do not lead to salvation. Let's see here. Because you have kept, in verse 10, it says, because you have kept in my word, the word of my perseverance. This word here is, the Ten Commandments that we all know and try to align our lives up with. It's really not the Ten Commandments. In Hebrew, it's the 10 words, or devarim. And here I think is a reference to that concept, who have kept my devarim, my word, which represents God's ways, God's laws. These people, the hallmark of these people, God is saying, because you have kept my word, my law, my Torah, and persevered. Find myself here. This word perseverance is, it means to be steadfast, consistence. It means to have endurance. It means to be patient. It means to be hopeful. It means to be confident. And we can boil this down to our personal lives, certainly, right? We might have troubles brought on us by the current events, or we might have troubles brought on us by other events. But we need to be recognized as a people that persevere. That's what this congregation is identified by. They're steadfast. Come thick or thin, come trial or blessing, they're steadfast in what they believe. They are steadfast in what they represent and the truth that they represent and the values that they represent. They're consistent. No matter what happens, they're consistent. They're like a rock, a capital R rock. God many times pictures himself as the rock. And we need to be stable and solid and have our homes built on that rock. We're not supposed to be blowing around and moved around emotionally by this virus or the lost jobs or whatever trouble is in our lives. We need to have endurance, and patience. Lots of times we're kind of fickle, aren't we? Where if something doesn't happen per our time schedule, we're like, okay, God isn't doing it, I'm going to do it myself. And God's going, no, we're going to go through this hardship, and it's going to take some time. I know personally, hardships never occurred in my time frame. They always occurred much longer than what I wished. But in so living through those kinds of times, I learned many things, hopefully, that God wanted me to learn. Confident. Are we confident even though we can't see any evidence for the things we hope for? Can we see the evidence of good relationships in our marriages and our friendships? Can we see evidence of a new job? Can we see evidence of things that we hope for? Many times the answer is no. Does that mean we go, okay, fine, throw it all away, start over? No, we need to be patient. let God do his work. We need to have endurance and wait for God to move. All the time, monitoring ourselves. And then a really neat verse here. It says, I will keep you from the hour of testing. Whoa, that's kind of cool. God is giving us, at least some congregations in the end times, a promise that he's going to keep this testing that's going to come upon the whole world. You know, this whole world, we can look at it this way. These judgments that are being taken off, these seals, these authorities that are coming, are being poured out on who? Those that have been disobedient, all in an effort by God to get them to turn from their wicked ways, their incorrect ways, and get them to get their eyes on him. Well, if we're already there, then some of those judgments are going to miss us. Does that mean we're all going to go to the beaches and have a wonderful few last year? No, it means that times may be very difficult, but God is going to put a shell of protection around us. And that's a very encouraging thing. No matter what might befall our nation, our world, our community, and our family lives, we can anchor our hope in that right here, God promised that he is going to keep us from this hour of testing. These judgments that fall on the world are not for us. They're for people that have not been attentive to God's voice. Verse 11, I'm coming quickly, hold fast what you have. And I talked about this last week, I won't belabor that point, but hold fast is not somebody that's hanging on for dear life. It's somebody that is acting like a king, who's victorious, who's ruling and reigning. How are we doing in ruling and reigning our lives and getting them in control and conforming them to God's ways? Are we king, or is our flesh king? Is our will king, or is God's will ruling and reigning in our lives? If that's the case, what's the promise here? Which is really kind of cool. It's verse 12. It says, he who overcomes. Overcome, the word there means conquer, victorious, a winner. Now this is in God's eyes, not ours or the enemy's, right? Did we conquer? Were we victorious? Did we win? He who overcomes, he who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will not go out from it anymore, and I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my new name. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the congregations. Now, if that isn't a marriage reference, I don't know what is. What happens when a bride marries a groom? Usually she takes on the name of the groom. She gets a new name. That comes right out of ancient Hebrew culture. And here God is using that cultural reference to hallmark the idea that God's ultimate goal is to make a bride for himself and rule and reign with her forever. Certainly during the 1,000-year reign, but forever. God's not going to write his name on. Remember last week I talked about that a name is the essence of a person? The essence of a person, in this case, the essence, the attributes, the skills, the qualities, the endurance, the hope, is this bride marries She doesn't abandon all of her identity. No, some of those identities she has are God-given, but she marries all that she has with all that he, the essence of God himself. So she works and thinks on behalf of the groom, the king. So these overcomers are victorious, and this should be our destiny. It's the destiny and hope of all believers. I'd like to end with 1 Corinthians 15. I've said this before, but I love this chapter. It's got so much meat in it, but I'm just going to pick a couple of verses out. Verse 26 says, it's a short little verse. It says, the last enemy that will be abolished is death. This verse is in the context of God promising everlasting life to all peoples. And then verse 51 through 53. It says, behold, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, for the trump will sound. Remember, this is Jubilee here, right? For the trump will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For this perishable must put on the imperishable, and this mortal must put on immortality. You know, when I was young, I read that and didn't get very excited. But now as I get older, man, I'm looking for that nice, perfect, refreshed, immortal body, as the one that I'm currently using is falling apart very quickly. But more importantly, we get to rule and reign and have authority with our King forever. Now, the Bible doesn't get into much detail about what we'll be doing, but it goes way beyond sitting in clouds with harps, doesn't it? He says that it's beyond our imagination to be able to comprehend. Look, you know, don't have the greatest imagination amongst us all, but I can imagine some pretty cool things. It's beyond that. That, during times of trouble, that's what we need to focus on. That our little life here is a whisper of time compared to eternity. And God wants us to act and behave like his bride now, because we're married to him. Remember the betrothal process? We're his bride now, even though the wedding hasn't been consummated. That's in the book of Revelation. Many chapters further on, however, where the fourth cup is drank by the groom, and then they're united as one married couple. And God rules and reigns and lifts up his bride, honors her with all kinds of authority. We don't know what that looks like very much, but it's certainly, you know, when I get there, I don't want to be in the back row. I want to have responsibility, and I want God to be able to say, my good and faithful servant. But it certainly spins out today as well. We need to act like his bride before we're the bride. And what does that look like? Well, we've been talking a lot about what it looks like. But when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And that certainly has some spiritual legs, doesn't it? During times of trouble, which we may be entering, and especially if we're entering the times of the seals, things will get a lot worse than what they are now. And we need to encourage ourselves and buttress ourselves and support ourselves with ourself. No, with the hope that God has given us of greater things to come with Him, but also buttress ourselves with real things right now so we don't get fooled by the enemy. And those things are truth implemented in our lives and relationship with God. I harp on this all the time, but I think as we enter into these times and they begin to unfold more and more, we're good stewards of our time and of our lives that God has given us if we pay special attention to the endurance and the ways that God chooses to live our life. So if we're choosing to live our life in ways we know full well that in some areas it doesn't please God, this is the time you take issue with those. And I tell myself all the time, I go, John, let's figure that out. And I've used this example multiple times. You should be able to go, I used to have a problem here a year ago, 5 months ago, last week maybe. But if I compare myself with times in the past, I can say I have gotten over, I've been victorious, and I hope that I'm going to continue to beat back my own ways and replace them with God's ways. Amen? Let's all stand for the Aaronic blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord's face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up His face upon you and give you peace. Amen. Join me with the Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat 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 Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shalom. Shabbat, Shalom. Shabbat, Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shalom. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.